Dude, holy, I was gonna pass out if I didn't get like a cookie. Have you ever come across someone so smart that it occurs to you that there's no way this person is religious or believes in God? Or maybe it's the other way around. Have you ever met someone who is so religious, or maybe even believes in God, that it occurs to you, while they are a nice person to maybe have around during tough times, they can't be that smart, right? I mean, they believe in God. Now, while that might not be you, if you're a Christian, a name probably popped up in your head. It could be a friend from high school, it could be even a family member. Well, rest assured, because by the end of this video, you are going to know three things. First, where does such a mindset even come from? So you're going to know the history of it. The second thing is, why is this mindset not just simply incorrect, but it's the complete opposite to what the reality is? And the third thing is, how do you diffuse or disarm someone who has this mindset when you're conversing with them? So without further ado, let's tackle the question that is the video's title: is it intellectually lazy to believe in God? Now first, let's lay down the foundation. The word faith points us back to the Latin word fides, which also means confidence, reliance, and credence. And just like confidence, reliability, and credibility, all these things need evidence and reason, and so did faith throughout most of history. In other words, faith was treated as intellectual, being paired with reason and evidence. But that is history. We fast forward now to 2026, you go outside, the word faith is being defined as belief without evidence, belief without reason, or even blind confidence. And then Sunday comes along and you think things are any better in the church, but instead when you're looking for evidence, you're faced with things such as, oh, you just don't have enough faith, or just have faith. What do you mean looking for evidence? You need more faith. So the big question is, how on earth did we get here? A word so violated that it means the complete opposite of what it used to mean. So let's dive straight into our first part, the history. Let's start here. It's pretty obvious that most people think that Christianity invented this mindset that faith equals believing without evidence. And the go-to proof of that is a line from the 3rd century Christian apologist Tertullian, which states, "Credo quia absurdum," or in other words, I believe because it is absurd. Now, honestly, reading that, I should probably just end the video and go to bed right now. But Tertullian never actually said that. What Tertullian actually wrote is "Porsus credible est quia ineptum est," meaning it is wholly credible because it is unsuited to human reason. And another thing that he wrote is "Certum est quia impossible est," meaning it is certain because it is impossible. Now, from the surrounding context of those lines, we know that Tertullian was trying to argue that the resurrection story was too strange to have been invented. So he's using strangeness as an evidence for the resurrection. So how do we get from "it is certain because it's impossible" to "I believe because it's absurd"? And historians were able to trace this to the 17th century writer Voltaire. First, Voltaire shifted this into "I believe because it's impossible," and then he bolted the word "absurd" onto the end. So "I believe because it's absurd." So there you have it. The most famous proof of Christian anti-reason is a complete fabrication from the Enlightenment period. Who would have thought? Now, in parallel during the Enlightenment period, while authors like Voltaire were pushing Christianity into this bottle of anti-evidence, the other authors were also trying to narrow down what is considered a rational belief. And they eventually fell down to rational belief is proportional to the evidence for it. So while Voltaire was pushing Christianity into this sort of anti-evidence, anti-reason bottle, the standard for rational thought was evidence itself, so it therefore concluded that Christianity is not rational belief. And an example of this, in 1877, W.K. Clifford turned this into a moral rule that it is wrong always for anyone to believe on insufficient evidence. And that's the real birth of what we mean when we say that believing without evidence is irresponsible. Now, while that sentiment was brewing in the secular world, the exact same sentiment was brewing in the Christian world from a completely different angle. During the 18th and 19th century, we faced the American Revivalism, which included the Great Awakenings. Now, from this, we had Charles Finney and later Billy Sunday, and what these people did is that they led these movements which prioritized emotional conversions over theological training. And as a result of this, this ended up planting a seed of American-based anti-intellectualism. If we go back to the 1920s fundamentalism, their issue wasn't that if you brought up evidence, they would be like, oh, get that away from me, you need to have faith, belief without evidence. Their issue was actually the complete opposite. It was supreme confidence that the evidence was simple, that the evidence was settled, and that it was already clearly on their side and backed the Bible in all cases. So what would occur from that is that they wouldn't engage in debate because they were really confident that the evidence already pointed to the correct sort of thing, which is the Bible. Now, historians blame that this overconfidence was actually the cause of this era's intellectual collapse, not humility. So this is where the irony is. It's kind of funny. You'd think that it would be them pushing away the evidence, but it's them laying claim to the evidence so confidently. Another issue which contributed to Christianity's anti-evidence sentiment is the quiet rewriting of the story of doubting Thomas. And this is what happens. Jesus tells Thomas, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And this was interpreted as seeking evidence means you have a weaker faith. But if you look at the actual story, the other disciples believed because they have seen the risen Jesus. So Thomas's real failure was not seeking evidence or looking for proof. Instead, it was him refusing to trust reliable testimony from people he already knew. And that nuance got flattened over the centuries into this pulpit version which everyone knows, don't ask, just believe. And this is reinforced by verses used incorrectly, like James chapter 1 verse 6, which is ask in faith without doubting, and this is used to frame doubt as some sort of spiritual danger. Now, this crisp and quotable version of faith being defined as belief without evidence, that comes from 2000's new atheism. Richard Dawkins defined faith as believing with no evidence or even against it, and Hitchens gave the internet, "What's claimed without evidence can be dismissed without evidence." And these went viral in the 2000s to the 2010s debate culture and became the default definition that we hear today. So we get here to 2026, and this faith versus evidence mindset, which you see in your classmates, your colleagues, even some family, that wasn't something that was there 2000 years ago, or even the first 1500 years. Instead, that comes from a variety of sources from both the secular, the atheist, and even the Christian side, as we've discussed. And as a summary, it was a collaboration between secular movements, atheist movements, Christian movements. All of them, they quietly rewrote the definition of faith to mean belief without evidence. And this is the definition that has been sticking around the last 20 years. And that leads us into part 2. Why is this mindset not just simply incorrect, but completely backwards? I think the best way to kick off this part is to look into what did the historic Christian tradition believe about faith and evidence. And the founding phrase is not just believe. Instead, it's a Latin line, fides quaerens intellectum, meaning faith seeks understanding. In other words, faith wasn't meant to be the end of thinking, but the start of it. And you can even see this in the actual word faith. If we look in the New Testament, the Greek word translated faith means pistis, which mostly just means trust, the same word you'd use for trusting a reliable person. And when the book of Hebrews defines faith as the assurance of things hoped for, we know assurance not to be a void, but instead it's something that has a grounding. Paul even explicitly demonstrates this when he defends the resurrection in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And what happens is that Paul doesn't just assert it happened, he lists the eyewitnesses, Peter, the 12 disciples, and then more than 500 people at once, and he adds almost offhandedly that most of them are still alive. That's not simply just belief, that's a go ask them yourself while you still can, which is an appeal to testimony that you can actually go and check. And Luke does something similar. He opens his gospel saying that he carefully investigated everything from the beginning so that his reader could know the certainty of what they'd been taught. He's framing his own book as verified history on purpose. And comically, even doubting Thomas fits this pattern once you look closely. The other disciples believed because they saw the risen Jesus with their own eyes. The whole story only makes sense if belief is supposed to track evidence. And as mentioned before, that's because that Thomas's actual failure was not seeking proof or evidence, instead it was refusing to trust reliable witnesses. Now this also carries all the way through church history. Anselm, a 11th century archbishop, wrote an entire logical proof for God's existence inside a book whose title literally translates to Faith-Seeking Understanding. And Thomas Aquinas went further, arguing that faith and reason can never actually conflict because God authored both of them and truth can't contradict itself. And for anyone who's familiar with basic cultural history, even the university system, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, all of these, they started as church institutions, built specifically to train people in logic and formal argument. And this instinct is what kicked off the scientific revolution and modern science. Johannes Kepler described his own astronomy as thinking God's thoughts after him. Isaac Newton wrote more pages on theology than physics. The whole premise was, if a rational God made an orderly universe, that universe is worth carefully investigating, which is a big part of why science took the shape it did. So, let's be honest, Do you think a tradition that names its eyewitnesses, that produces actual logical arguments for God, that helped invent both the university system and the scientific method, do you think that kind of tradition was built on, hey, don't look, just believe without evidence? I don't think so. I think it's clear to all of us that that slogan is just a modern import and it's not where the story started. And that leads us to our third and final part. How do we diffuse this mindset in the people that we converse with? Now, for anyone who is engaged in debate or politics or philosophy or even evangelism and have had many conversations, you guys would know that these fields are completely filled with slogans. First, reframe the goal. The goal in these conversations shouldn't be to win, and as you have more and more of these conversations, you'll realize that there are slogans thrown around. And instead of setting your goal to win the entire debate or conversation, instead you could focus on getting one of these slogans or confident assumptions to wobble. And that's usually all it takes to turn that slogan into a genuine question. Next, make them define their terms. Most people parrot, faith is belief without evidence, I like to ask, when you say faith, do you mean believing with zero reasons at all, or trusting something based on good evidence but incomplete? And this usually catches them off guard because they're using a stipulated definition from the Dawkins and the Hitchens era without realizing it's actually still a contested definition. And once you get them to define it, they often drift towards trust based on reasons, even if incomplete, which quietly changes the whole debate. And from there, I like to point out that everybody runs on unprovable trust. And there's plenty of creative examples you could use, like, can you prove that your senses are telling you the truth? Can you prove that this is not a dream? Can you prove that the outside world around you is not a simulation and it's actually a real world? All these things, they are assumed, and they're done so without full proof. And the point is that everyone, including committed atheists, already accepts some beliefs on trust rather than airtight proof. So the question is now not proof versus no proof, it's whether a given trust is reliable. And that is a very different and more rational question than what the initial framing was. Your next move is to bring the receipts. Go check for yourself, that's what you're gonna say. And it obviously depends on what kind of conversation you're having, but ideally you eventually want to bring them to Jesus. And often that takes the shape of showing them the Gospels. Hey, here's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Why don't you have a read, learn what kind of person Jesus is? See for yourself. So the move here isn't to prove those claims immediately as true. Instead, is to show that the New Testament authors were appealing to checkable testimony, and they weren't just simply asking people to turn their brain off. Now, another direction you could take the conversation from there is to turn this evidential standard back on them, in a fair manner, of course. You could ask something like, what would actually count as evidence for you? Is there anything, even hypothetically, that would change your mind? And usually the answer is something that's completely extreme or simply just nothing. And from there you could gently point out to them that that's the exact unfalsifiable problem that skeptics usually accuse religious belief of having. But now you've just pointed this back at them. Now this is important. You don't want to frame this as some kind of gotcha moment. You want to keep this conversation as genuinely curious, because the point mentioned here is mutual, it's not one-sided. And eventually you want to bring them to Christ. Next, I'd actually help them figure out where their definition came from. It could be from that Dawkins, Hitchens, New Atheism era. It could be from that 1700s Voltaire fabrication, etc. The point being is, while you could obviously point these as incorrect, you also need to show that Christianity, such as Anselm, Aquinas, they had the correct framing of faith being including of evidence, not without evidence. And what this does, as mentioned before, is it wobbles that strong assumption, that slogan that they had. And another move that I'll throw in there is don't overclaim your side. And this is really good, especially for honesty, because the reality is that there are actually churches out there which are anti-intellectual and they are doubt shaming, etc. And that's problematic. But if you're able to acknowledge these things while also explaining that Christian history was extremely supportive and strengthening of faith being defined as belief as a result of evidence, then it maintains a really nice honesty in the discussion and definitely helps your conversations go further, and that's how you actually diffuse these kind of mindsets. Keep in mind, you're not trying to convert anyone around in one conversation, you're simply just trying to replace a slogan with a question. Because the next obvious step is once they redefine faith as not being without evidence but because of evidence, now you're going to be right there and ready with the evidence on a silver platter, which is the Gospels. So now I will conclude. Is it intellectually lazy to believe in God? And it depends entirely on which faith you mean. Blind, don't ask questions belief is real, and it deserves the criticism it gets, but that's not what the word meant for most of Christian history. Paul names his eyewitnesses, Luke called himself an investigator, Aquinas built a whole system on faith and reason never contradicting each other, and the faith equals no evidence definition everyone repeats today isn't ancient at all. Instead, it's 300-year-old argument sharpened by Enlightenment philosophers and packaged into one-liners by a couple of very quotable writers in the 2000s, now passed off as common knowledge. So, before you call someone's faith lazy or defend your own, ask what faith and evidence actually mean, because most people repeating that line have never had to define either one. Anyways, this is MVD, Crucified with Christ. Like and follow. Ciao.